Well, I thought that today we might take a special moment to share a few words of Torah, but to really tell you a little bit of a story. And I'd like to couch this story with this moment of Torah for a moment, with regard to the Torah portion that we're reading this week. This week we're reading the third Torah portion in the book of Deuteronomy, a Torah portion that's called Ekev. And for those of us who follow the prophetic literature and who follow those theological deep statements of the Hebrew Bible, we know that these first three Torah portions of the book of Deuteronomy is where we find the finest expressions of Jewish theology, of what is at the very core of Jewish faith, of really not only is at the very core of the Jewish faith, but in certain ways what is at the very core of the human condition. And so we look for these Torah portions and this Torah portion that we read this week for special guidance. And sometimes it speaks to us. And I want to take a moment and express something that spoke to me within the last week. We get into this Torah portion of Ekev, and the Torah portion of Ekev mixes the story of the journey of the Israelites with the promise of the entrance into the promised land and these statements of deep theology interspersed in this Torah portion. And we arrive in chapter 8. And the Hebrew Bible says to us, God says, Kol ha-mitzvah hazot, all of this commandment, all of these laws that I command you so that you may live. So that you may live. So that you may arrive in the promised land. So that you may inherit the promised land. But the key is, so that you may live. And immediately after that, the Torah portion goes into a rehearsal of the 40 years in the desert. And those 40 years in the desert, throughout the 40 years in the desert, God afflicted us, God starved us, God tried us, and God did all of these things in order to try to test us and to see what was in our hearts. And here we are 40 years later on the brink of entering into the promised land. And for 40 years, God delivered us the manna in the desert. And for 40 years, we had to travel out there in the desert. And then comes this statement, why did God feed us the manna in the desert for 40 years? Lehodiacha, in order to teach us, shelo al halechem levado, not on bread alone, not on sustenance alone. Yichyeh ha'adam, should humanity live. Ki al kol pi dvar Adonai yichyeh ha'adam. Rather, humanity should live on the basis of the completeness, the fullness, the wholeness of the Word of God. Now, that's a little bit difficult. We understand why this comes following the story of the manna. The manna, as you know, came from the heavens every single day, came from the heavens. Couldn't be planned, nobody planted it. Nobody knew what the season for the manna was. It came every single day from the heavens. Nobody could spare manna for the following day. Came every single day from the heavens. The children of Israel picked up the manna, ate the manna. They didn't know what was coming tomorrow. They didn't know if it was coming tomorrow. Every single day, the manna dropped from heaven. Lechem, bread, sustenance, comes from the earth. It has to be planted. There is a season for wheat. There's a season for barley. There's a season for corn. It has to be worked. And so bread comes forth from the earth. right? And it requires labor. Unlike manna that comes upon the Word of God. So perhaps the Bible meant, as opposed to the manna, you're going to go into the land and you're going to have to grow bread. Well, that's a good idea. Rabbi Samson Raphael Hirsch points out yet another teaching about this. The word lechem in Hebrew, bread, sustenance, is the same word that is the core or the root of the word milchama, which means war or struggle. In other words, how do we get bread? How is it that we wrest bread from the ground? We have to struggle for it. We have to fight for it. We have to fight for food. We have to fight for our sustenance. We have to fight for our survival. We have to fight for our living. We have to work. And we have to work hard. And perhaps what the Hebrew Bible here is telling us is not just that this is a difference between the manna coming from the heavens and the bread coming forth from the earth. Perhaps it has to do with the fact that we have to not lose sight of the fact that while we work for a living, we struggle for a living, and sometimes it's really difficult, it's not only that work that sustains us, it's also the inspiration of the Word of God. Perhaps there is something else here. In fact, the rabbis in the Midrash teach us yet another lesson that is related to this. And this really touches on the human condition. Animals live by sustenance. Animals don't think about the world to come. They don't think about the future. They don't think about the world as it should be. Animals live by bread and water. They live by that kind of sustenance. Divine beings, angels live by the Word of God. They don't need sustenance. They don't need bread and water. We human beings need both sustenance, bread and water, and the Word of God. We are in between. We are the intermediaries. Perhaps this really speaks to the human condition. So for a moment here we have this deep statement, Lo al halechem levado yichyeh ha'adam. Not by bread alone, which means not completely not by bread, but not by bread alone, also by the Word of God. For the Bible to go on and to say, for 40 years you've walked in the desert, and simlatcha lo balata, the dress you wear, the clothes you wear, are still intact. Veraglecha lo vatzeka, and your foot did not swell to the point where you cannot walk. In other words, we can still engage in the journey. But we ask ourselves the question, what does this mean? And this is chapter 8, the beginning of chapter 8. And we leave chapter 8, and 2 chapters later, in chapter 10, the middle of chapter 10, we find yet another statement. Echoed in the prophets, the Hebrew Bible asks us the question, Ve'ata Yisrael, ma Adonai Elohecha shoel me'imcha. Now, Israel, what does God ask of you? What does God ask of us? To fear God, to dignify God, to respect God, to guard God's commandments, to walk in God's paths, and to love God, bechol levavecha uvechol nafshecha, with all of our hearts and with all of our souls. But it goes on. It goes on to say how great God is and describe the greatness of God. Elohei HaElohim, Adon HaAdonim, the God of all gods, master of all mastery, master mistress of all masters and mistresses. Ha'el, Hagadol, Hagibor, Vehanora, the words we just sang in the Amidah, in the Tfilah where we all stood up. Ha'el Hagadol HaGibor VaNorah comes from chapter 10 of the book of Deuteronomy, the great, the overcoming God, the awesome God, but not El Elyon, rather, Shelo Nosef Anav, who never differs in judgment, never expresses a preference, and never takes a bribe. Never prefers one party to another in judgment, never prejudges, and never takes a bribe. Oseh mishpat yatom va'almana, advocates for the orphan and for the widow. And ve'ohev et hager, and loves the stranger. Latet lo lechem vesimla, to give the stranger bread, sustenance, the same lechem, lo ala lechem levado yichya adam, the same word, gives the stranger lechem, sustenance, and simla, clothing to wear. Following which comes the one commandment that ends this passage. Ve'ahavtem et hager, love the stranger. Ki gerim hayitem be'eretz Mitzrayim, for you were strangers in the land of Egypt. Now I'd like to tell you a story. Some of you may know that a number of months ago, Dr. Dan Sessler and Dr. Jimena Valdez Sessler made a very generous contribution to College Now in order to create the Temple-Tifereth Israel Scholar series, an entire scholarship for BIPOC students, students who are black, indigenous, or people of color. And the Racial Justice Task Force gathered together a few months ago and selected our first Temple-Tifereth Israel scholar who would be able to attend college thanks to this generous scholarship. That scholar is Elena Johnson Joseph. This last week, I met her. It was in the afternoon. I needed a cup of coffee, so I met her in a coffee shop. And here comes this stranger and told me her story. And by the way, she allowed me to share some of her story. Elena Johnson Joseph is one of 10 siblings. She grew up in Cleveland, and a number of her siblings are older than she is and have already left the house and are living their lives in other places. And she has 4 younger siblings. The next sibling younger than she is approximately 10 years younger than she is. So through middle school and high school, junior high school and high school, she would come back home from school, she would cook, she would clean, she would take care of the kids, she would bathe them. Mother is working in healthcare, works very long hours, sometimes night shifts. The father is working long hours. She was very often routinely home taking care of these children. She makes her way to the John Jay High School. She's admitted to the John Jay High School for Science and Medicine on Stokes Boulevard. She makes it into the high school, it's a magnet high school, makes it into the high school, does very well academically, wonderfully academically, works very hard, takes care of the children, and is an athlete. She's a basketball player, she's a point guard. She was selected as the MVP, the most valuable player, for her district before graduating. Towards going to college, she thinks about where she's going to go to college, what she's going to do, how this is going to work out for her. And she speaks to her mother and she says to her mother, you know, I think I may want to stay in Cleveland. How are you going to take care of the children? How is this going to work out? You work long hours. How are you going to do this? Perhaps I should stay in Cleveland and help out. She could go to college on a basketball scholarship. You know, gifted, wonderful young person. I'm listening to this story and I hear her say, her mother told her, sat her down and said to her, "You go about your life. You do what you have to do, and we will manage. We will work this out." This young woman, this young person, is going to Ohio State University and is going to go into healthcare. She wants to be a nurse like her mother. I'm listening to her story and I'm thinking to myself, how can I not love this young person? And the energy, the commitment, the determination, the passion, the talent, and the potential that she represents. And I'm thinking this as I see her, as I speak with her, as I take her story in, and she looks me in the eye and she says to me, "Thank you for investing in my future." And I thought to myself, "Lo al halechem levado yichyeh ha'adam." Humanity should not live by the sustenance of bread alone. Ki al kol pi Adonai yichyeh ha'adam. For we, humanity, should live by the inspiration of the Word of God and of the human potential. Shabbat Shalom.